Hi guys, welcome to part 2. Today we're going to talk about some of the common psychological hurdles you will face when pursuing learning a language through immersion. Immersing in a new language can be stressful, even for people like me who have a great deal of experience language learning. And actually, when 500 patrons are reached, I will either begin learning a new language to around C1 level, which will hopefully be German, as that's the language I'm currently most interested in. Or I will start making a concerted effort at learning Japanese pitch accent and improving my abilities in that language before my move to Japan next year. Which of these I end up doing will be decided by the community, so I guess my fate is in your hands here, guys. But when I think about these two tasks, particularly about the task of learning German, even I feel a great deal of anxiety at the very thought of it, because I know how big of an investment taking on a new language really is. Particularly if I'm telling the community that I would be in it with the goal of reaching an advanced level in that language. And knowing all of the other work that I ask of myself, it's pretty scary even considering this sort of new commitment. But ultimately, I think it's probably important that I engage in the language learning process again, so that I can be as helpful as possible to other beginners, because we'll be in the same shoes then. Part 2 of this series is actually broken down into 2 videos. In today's video, I'm going to talk about what are likely the first psychological stressors that one will encounter in their immersion learning journey. I will talk about doubting you can learn a language, doubting you will learn a language, doubting whether language learning is even for you, a lot of common reasons for lack of motivation, and lastly, I will talk about the feeling of lack of progress. In the second video, we'll talk about some other psychological stressors, such as the feeling that we're not progressing as fast as others, the feeling of being intimidated by our goal, the feeling that we're doing something wrong, the feeling of boredom, the fear of immersion itself, and perhaps the most pervasive, the general feeling of discomfort when immersing or studying flashcards. And to finish out the second video, we will talk about some of the strategies we can use to help mitigate some of the stressors we introduce. We'll talk about how we can use time boxing, we'll talk about taking into account our own individual life circumstances when setting our goals, and some ways that can help us decide whether or not language learning is ultimately a good goal for us or not. Perhaps the first stressor we will encounter when we begin to pursue, and more realistically, even before we begin to pursue immersion learning, is the feeling of doubt. I remember myself, even though I have the background of being adopted from Brazil to America to a family of English-speaking parents, and therefore having first-hand experience that immersion learning works, as that's how I learned English. But I still encountered an uneasy feeling of doubt when I started to prepare to learn Japanese. I knew intellectually that immersion learning worked. I even had direct experience as a child that showed me firsthand that it worked. Yet there I was with feelings of doubt then, and truthfully, even with similar feelings of doubt now when I think about learning German. But what is this feeling? Personally, I think one needs to more closely examine it. It is likely that the characteristics of this feeling vary, and perhaps even substantially vary in each of us. But when I examine this feeling, it seems to have 2 core components. The first component is doubting whether you are capable of learning your target language. The second component is doubting you will actually learn your target language. This feeling of doubt is actually related to your feeling about the actual feasibility of the goal itself. For example, let's say you're learning Japanese. There would be an actual feeling of doubt about whether you're really capable of learning the language or not. Meaning, that you think that even if you tried everything you could to learn this language, that you might still fail. And in the case of Japanese, it's actually quite understandable that someone might have this feeling, as I am relatively sure that in the vast majority of countries worldwide, it has the reputation of being an extremely difficult language to learn. But let's talk about instead if you were thinking about learning Spanish. I think the same learner's feeling of doubt towards learning Spanish would likely be much weaker than towards learning Japanese. Spanish doesn't exactly have the reputation of being an extremely difficult language to learn. Whether that's true or not is besides the point. What's important is to recognize the types of thoughts that are likely contributing to your doubts about your capabilities of learning your target language. In fact, even if one recognizes the 2 components of this feeling of doubt, it is quite easy to get distracted and think that the first component of this feeling is the most dire. But I feel that for the vast majority of us, the first component and the doubts about whether we can learn our target language or not isn't even valid. Now, I know that it seems to make sense to wonder whether a goal is feasible for yourself to begin with. And for a lot of goals, it certainly does make sense to think about this. You almost certainly can't be a professional basketball player if you're far below average in height, for example. But does it really make sense to ask the same question when it comes to language learning? I personally don't really think so. And to be clear, what I'm talking about right now is not whether you think you are capable of learning a language under your current individual circumstances or not. But rather, I'm talking about whether you think yourself literally physiologically capable of learning your target language or not. But I will be talking about dealing with individual circumstances in the next video. Now, I know it may seem silly to some viewers to see me here talking about someone who doubts whether it's physiologically possible for them to learn a second language or not. But I assure you, after talking with many people in the community over the years, there very much exists this little fear in a subset of learners that somehow they're just not capable of learning a second language. Especially among those of us tackling the languages that have the reputation of being the most difficult, like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or even Arabic. But let's take a moment and examine that thought. Does it really make sense for us to wonder whether we are capable of learning a new language? I mean, we know that it's at least possible to reach fluency in a second language because we have so many examples of people who have successfully done so. So I would argue that if we are someone fortunate enough to not have any mental handicaps that could somehow impede us from learning a foreign language, that we must simply accept that the possibility is absolutely minuscule, that somehow we are so distinct from those who have succeeded that somehow we cannot. The chances are extremely good that if you're capable of understanding your native language without issue, that you easily have the capacity to learn any other language that we humans use as a medium of communication. So put yourself at ease when it comes to concerns about your actual capacity to learn a given language. But what about if you believe you can learn a language but don't have great confidence in whether you'll do what you need to do in order to actually learn one? Now, this is a much more complex problem. The feeling about whether someone can actually carry out one's goals can sit quite heavily on one's conscience. And this is actually where I find myself when I start thinking about committing to start learning German. Also, I know this is where many of you end up once you realize how long the road ahead might be until you reach your language learning goals. So let's try to define the sort of feeling I'm talking about here. Well, basically what happens is when someone starts to understand the sort of nearly daily commitment that their language learning will need to be in order to reach their goals, they begin to viscerally be able to project forward in time that it will require them to be committed for many more months or even years to come. And they begin to have doubts about whether this is something they will continue or even want to continue. Now, there are two main reasons for this type of doubt. One, the learner doubts they can really commit to learning their target language. Two, the learner begins to doubt whether they even really want to learn their target language. When it comes to doubting whether you can really commit to working hard long term, once you begin to understand the real scale of the commitment before you, one must really consider that just about every type of long-term goal you set for yourself is going to require some sort of daily commitment. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this video when I talk about motivation. Anyways, if one wants to achieve a goal and has actually reaching that goal as their main priority, for example, they accept that even though there's a part of them that tells them that they should reach their goal in 1, 2, or 3 years and tries to set a deadline for them, that the best thing that they can do is not take the desires of that voice too seriously. If your goal is to actually accomplish your goal, then you must step back and accept who and what you are today, and what you can consistently achieve on a daily basis, and how hard you can really expect yourself to work. If you don't have a proven track record of working really hard towards other long-term goals, or just have way too many other responsibilities, then setting a ridiculous goal like definitely achieving advanced fluency in Chinese in 1 year is most certainly going to cause great deals of doubt to arise as to whether you will really do it or not. Even if the reality is that if you converted all of your free time to learning Chinese, that you would actually be able to achieve that goal, it's very unlikely that most people would be happy doing so, and I probably don't recommend anyone do that. I have a history of studying languages very intensively for many hours a day, but that's either when I was a student or chose jobs with a low level of commitment so that I had a lot of free time to myself. And I treated my language learning basically as a job, as an important responsibility in my life. But I even gave myself time for leisure activities that were completely unrelated to language learning. So before you go and set these very extreme goals that demand the vast majority or even all of your free time, I would examine my other responsibilities and how you usually enjoy to spend your free time when it's unrelated to language learning. Ultimately, your doubts about whether you will learn a language or not are stemming from conflicts with either your responsibilities or how you enjoy spending your leisure time. Perhaps you're not really enjoying the language learning process, or perhaps you have a lot of other responsibilities that tire you out before you get around to your language learning. So these doubts about whether we will accomplish our language learning goals have a lot to do with what we are asking of ourselves. If you ask too much of yourself to the point where it's not compatible with the type of life you like to live, then you're going to have these doubts about how long you can sustain that sort of behavior. So I would recommend being rather conservative about introducing language learning into your life until you better understand where it might fit in. Sustainability is the primary factor that should be considered when committing to a long-term goal after all. If you simply focus on setting sustainable daily goals, I truly feel your feelings of doubt about whether you will achieve your long-term goals will largely, if not completely, evaporate. I recommend you watch my video, Language Learning is Easy, because in it I talk about a technique that can really help you to start setting more sustainable daily goals if you've been having trouble. Now, what about if you're beginning to doubt whether language learning is even for you at all? This is actually a pretty delicate problem because it's relatively easy to give up on your goals by convincing yourself that you didn't really want that goal to begin with. But here again, I think it's really important to try and inquire about this feeling and to make sure that you're really being honest with yourself. I think if you've been someone who's consistently immersed and studied for a substantial period of time without missing many days, let's say for at least a period of 2 months or so, and if you have a pretty good track record of working towards other long-term goals, then trusting your first judgment is probably the best course of action, I would guess. If someone like that doesn't really feel that language learning is for them, then I would guess that their intuition is likely correct and that it probably isn't. However, if you have had trouble thus far, missed many days, haven't been consistent overall, and perhaps also don't have a track record of working hard towards long-term goals, then I would suggest you to be much more cautious about your feelings of doubt and the voice telling you that maybe language learning just isn't for you. We must acknowledge that in our heads, we all have different voices who are vying for our attention. Not literally, guys. Don't worry, I'm not hearing voices or anything. Not yet anyways, and hopefully I age gracefully and never do either. What I'm saying is that there's almost always a voice telling you to quit what you're doing and take the road of least resistance. Let me briefly introduce you to how I think about this. I will simplify things and just talk about what we may consider our two main voices. Just for fun, I'm going to call the first voice the computer, and I'm going to call the second voice the ape. I believe we have this voice that likes to tell us who we are, who we want to be, and what our goals and future plans ought be. That's the computer. It's generally well-meaning and wants the best for us. And then we have this voice that tells us lots of fun things like, better some cool new tweets on Twitter right now. Let's watch a couple YouTube videos. How about the gym? Stop working, time to have some fun. Let's eat some cookies! Hey, yo, time for drinks, baby! Woo! Oh, sorry guys, I lost control for a second, but yeah, you probably guessed it. That's the ape. And honestly, although he can be a lot of fun, he's really just kind of a dick. And meanwhile, although good intention, one's computer can often suggest goals that one's ape just simply isn't willing to allow either. The reality is, guys, in my belief, the computer, no matter how wise and noble, no matter how calculating and precise, will just never rid himself of that damn ape. The computer must at the end of the day appease it and set goals that the ape won't overreact in opposition to. So even though I'd personally love my computer to deal the final blow and finally end the battle, defeating the ape once and for all, that's just not going to happen. The best we can hope for is an uneasy and maybe even temporary peace. Think the Christmas truce of 1914. Look it up, guys. It's pretty interesting. Think the Korean Peninsula. Dare I say, think Pakistan and India. It is my opinion that the sooner we recognize and accept this dynamic, the sooner that we can learn to make it work for us. If we look around to some of the people near us and look into their eyes, from a safe social distance, of course. Don't cancel me yet, I'm just getting started. Just look into the eyes of the people around you, your family, your friends, maybe even your local friendly mob boss for all I care. Just pick somebody. And you'll instantly see that beautiful sparkle, that shining beacon of hope in each and every single one of their eyes. That, my friends, is but the afterglow of just the most recent thermonuclear detonation in the Great Computer Ape War. It really does seem to be a never-ending conflict, and in the future I will either make a video or even a video series about how I appease my ape, keep my computer from miscalculating, and overall just stay productive. Okay guys, I'm going to cool it on the weak attempts at humor for a bit so that we can go ahead and bring this around full circle. As we've established, unless you have a very legitimate reason to believe that you are incapable of learning a foreign language, the reality is that you almost certainly can. If you still need assurances of that, I recommend simply watching some of the many success stories on YouTube or elsewhere on the internet. Eventually, we here at Migaku also plan to compile some of the best success stories we've heard out in the community to serve as a constant reminder that you can do this too. But again, what about those of us who simply doubt whether language learning is really for them or not? Like I said, if you really haven't been consistent in your language learning and haven't yet shown yourself capable of working hard towards other long-term goals, you should be very skeptical of this voice, which likely may just be the ape telling you that language learning isn't for you so that it doesn't have to work hard. The reality is that any long-term goal feels difficult and unpleasant at times, particularly at the beginning. And particularly those goals that are largely self-motivated, where it's more difficult to leverage our social relationships, such as immersion learning. Hopefully in the future we can organize our community in such a way that it will facilitate us working towards and eventually accomplishing our language learning goals. So what does going after our goals mean in the context of the computer-ape dynamic? It means maneuvering in such a way that your computer retains enough control on a daily basis that you're able to consistently do the activities that your goal requires of you. Controlling, appeasing, and working with your inner ape is a skill that can be developed. And like I said, I will be talking about this in the future. So if you're interested in hearing about how I keep my inner ape in check, then hit that subscribe button. But if for now you want to get a good idea about where your natural interests and your ability to go after your goals stand, I recommend you watch the second part of my language learning is easy video. And I really recommend those of you who are struggling and thinking about quitting to at least try the activity mentioned there. And also to remember that at the end of the day, all long-term goals are going to require sacrifice. No matter how easy of a goal you set for yourself, the reality is that it will require some sacrifice to achieve. A goal requires time, energy, and paying the opportunity cost of doing activities related to your goal while foregoing unrelated activities. I've heard some argue before that there must be goals that can be achieved just through sheer desire and intrinsic motivation. But of the people I personally know or follow who are good at setting and achieving their goals, they all share a similar mindset. And that is that in all likelihood for the vast majority of the population, goals require both intrinsic motivation and discipline. If you're lacking one of the two, you will almost certainly fail. So again, I advise you to be wary of quitting just because of your doubts about success or a voice telling you that it isn't for you. If you have not yet demonstrated to yourself that you have the discipline to go after some form of long-term goal, then the unfortunate reality is that you probably can't even trust your intuition when it comes to selecting a goal. I've known some people that feel that when they've found a goal that's actually suitable for them, that they will always feel happy and willing to work on it and that they won't require discipline. But unfortunately, of the people I know who've said that, not a single one of them have ever completed a self-motivated long-term goal before. And a few of them were rampant starter quitters, trying everything under the sun and yet stuck with nothing. And I actually talked with them about my own feelings that even if you've selected a goal that's actually really good for yourself, and even if you actually have really high intrinsic motivation to go after that goal, that doesn't mean you're going to be happy and motivated to work on it every single day. There are so many circumstances in life. Life is so complex. There are many factors that are going to affect your daily motivation from day to day. Again, before you give up, just remember, every long-term goal you're going to pursue is almost certainly going to bring up the same doubts you're having right now. It is almost an absolute that every goal you're ever going to have is going to at least bring some form of self-doubt with it and the desire to quit. You're going to have to accept that. Those feelings are just a natural part of challenging yourself, and I believe that overcoming them is a key component of personal growth. It is through building discipline, a resilience, and an acceptance of the psychological burdens of your goal, and by using mitigating strategies that you will ultimately find a sustainable way of pursuing goals in your own life. In the next video, I plan to talk about a potential strategy that you can use to probe whether language learning really is or isn't for you. So I suggest you give that a watch if that's the position you currently find yourself in. Another huge barrier many of us encounter is the feeling of lack of motivation. Before we begin, first I just want to say that I've never heard of or met someone who consistently achieved their goals who's never had any issues with lack of motivation. That being said, there are levels to this, and the vast majority of goal achievers that I've known or heard about usually only have issues with short-term motivation, perhaps at the scale of a week or two at most. But most often just have an issue on a day here or there, or maybe a few days in a row. So if you're having that sort of issue with motivation, I just want to say that you don't have anything to worry about. It's completely normal. And there are some decently easy ways of dealing with it that I've found and that work for me, and that I hope will work for you, and that I will share with you momentarily. If you find you're having some form of long-term chronic motivational issues that hit you almost every day for a month or more at a time, then I suggest you follow the steps that are going to be laid out in the next video about whether you really even want to be doing language learning. But I find that many people who have trouble with motivation and end up with large streaks of not going after their goals are often setting goals that are way out of line with their natural capabilities of pursuing them. Their consistent inability to meet goals that were set inappropriately and were completely unrealistic to begin with eventually causes them to fall into a spiral of being demotivated. For those people, and if you find yourself having that type of trouble, I recommend you watch my Language Learning is Easy video, particularly the second part, where I go over a strategy about how you can go about finding and setting better, more manageable goals. It is quite common to have a day here or even a streak of days there where you don't feel very motivated to either immerse or do your SRS reviews. This is natural, not something to be overly concerned about. And to be honest, I'm not that motivated today. And that's because my only day off this week was interrupted due to some issues that were completely outside of my control. So I was forced to work for part of my designated day off, and therefore just generally don't feel that I relieved my stress as well as I would normally do when I have a proper rest day. And also I had some errands to run today which ran late and caused me to start working at a considerably later hour than I usually would. Which means that today I won't actually be able to accomplish all of my daily goals, and that can be extremely demotivating if you allow it to be. But luckily I'm pretty disciplined, and although I did allow many more short breaks today and basically time blocked my way through the day, I was still able to get a considerable amount of work done. And today I just had to accept that daily goals are ultimately just that. They are goals. They're something to aim at. And failing to at times reach those goals is just a part of the process. And the truth is, you almost certainly will not always achieve your daily goals. It's better to accept that now and not expect that from yourself, but obviously continue to strive to complete them. So anyways, a useful strategy that I've found when I'm particularly demotivated that works for me is to simply ask less of myself and give myself a chance to recover. What you can do is simply try to ask less of yourself on those days where you're feeling particularly motivated. And I know that for a large part of people, and particularly on those days that they find themselves with a lack of motivation, that their SRS reviews are the worst part of the process for them. So let's go ahead and talk about some of that now. Unfortunately, there's no feature to take a day off in the most popular SRSs. And if you're not using the Migaku Vacation add-on, taking a day off or reducing the number of reviews you do on a given day comes at the cost of the debt of flashcard reviews that you will have to pay for in the future. Even considering this, it might still be best to go ahead and do maybe half or as many of your reviews as you can, and then just try to immerse for some time if possible afterwards. This of course would still mean that some of your reviews would carry over and the next day you would have a bigger SRS review burden. Currently, without the vacation add-on, there's not a real fix to this problem. However, if you're using the Migaku vacation add-on, after you've done some of your reviews for the day, you can go ahead and use its sick day feature. That sick day feature allows you to just move all of your reps back one day and just give yourself some breathing room. Now, one needs to be careful not to overuse this feature because of course it will affect your retention rate. But if used strategically and only when you're having a rough time of it, it's much better than the alternative of continuing to lose motivation while you get behind on your reviews. But anyways, the reason I recommend still trying to at least do some of your reviews is because it's precisely at the times that you're having a tough time with motivation that you have the best opportunity to improve at being disciplined. It is precisely by overriding your desires to not do anything or to do way less and doing a little bit more that you build those pathways in your brain that lead to more disciplined behavior. With practice, those pathways become dominant and it becomes easier to behave with discipline over time. That being said, if you're having a really rough time and can't put yourself to even do any reviews, maybe just do 2 or 3 and then go ahead and use the sick day feature and send them off one day into the future. On those days, maybe it's just best to even immerse at a low level of attention and just go ahead and keep the habit going. It's also important to not fall into the trap of getting overly hung up about missed days. Missing days causes great anxiety about returning to the task itself, and many people find it greatly demotivating. And this demotivation leads into a spiral of them missing even more days, and it can very, very quickly get out of control. I of course feel that a large part of this anxiety that immersion learners who use an SRS get when they miss days is because of the SRS itself. Current SRSs don't take into account the human element in the equation at all, and they expect everyone to do their reviews every single day. Anyways, luckily I'm working on an SRS that works in a very different way and takes into account the human element. So if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe to the channel because I'll be talking about that in the not too distant future. Anyways, it's kind of like playing a video game and then getting too busy and not being able to get back to it and taking a month or 2 off before you get a chance to complete it. It becomes very difficult to get motivated to play that game again, even if it's actually what you want to do, since it feels like there's a high cost of getting back into it. You might have forgotten the controls, you might have forgotten the game mechanics, where you were in the story, and what you were even in the middle of doing. It's often easier to just quit and never go back to the game, and to be honest guys, this happens to me all the time. Please don't take a look at my Switch account, just don't. But anyways, in fact, we all know that coming back to the SRS is even worse than coming back to a video game because it just feels like there's so much more on the line. If you have the Migaku Vacation add-on, something you can do is use the catch-up feature to slowly catch up cards over time. If you don't and are substantially behind, I recommend you just going through your review slowly over a given period of days, and either outright deleting or suspending all the cards you get wrong. This also applies to people who have a huge load of cards they're catching up when using the Migaku Vacation add-on with the catch-up feature as well. Anyways, this technique will allow you to quickly give the cards you still remember a new interval while not wasting time with the cards you've forgotten. Then after you've caught up, if you've decided to suspend those cards, you can slowly start reintroducing them. Or if you've deleted them, simply move on and start learning new cards. The feeling of needing to keep every single one of your cards is toxic, and I recommend you remember that your target language isn't going anywhere. Deleting cards that are causing you trouble means relieving stress and improving your mood towards your goal. This is actually a mistake that I made many times before, and it actually took a really long time for me to break the spell and learn from my mistakes. But anyways, all the words will still be out there in your immersion. You'll have many more chances to acquire them, so feel free to let them go. The SRS is meant as a supplement to help our language study, and yet its constant demands from us lead many of us to nothing but demotivation. Luckily, the Migaku Vacation add-on allows you to select which days of the week you want to study and which days you want to rest. And of course, it allows you to schedule vacations away from the SRS, which allows you to actually go on vacation or just take a break without having to worry about SRS reviews. The reality is that many people have trouble keeping up with the 7-day SRS review schedule. Myself included, I fell behind countless times. But since developing the vacation add-on, I've actually tried to use it to study a few things. And I can honestly say that one does not need to study in the SRS 7 days a week to get the majority of the benefit from it. So using the vacation add-on, take a day off to spend with our family or friends should be encouraged for everyone who wants to do so. And I plan to release the Migaku vacation add-on publicly in the very near future, hopefully at the latest sometime next month. The very reason I developed it was because of all of these personal issues that I had with the SRS and all the issues that I saw out in the community as well. I sincerely hope that in the future, many of you benefit from its use. The SRS I'm developing is also getting closer to release by the day. And as I've said before, it works in a completely innovative way that injects the human element back into it and should incredibly reduce the burden of these overdue reviews. As far as immersion goes, it is easy to lose one's motivation, particularly when they don't even feel that they are improving. But I will talk about feeling like you're not improving in the very next section of this video. But anyways, if you feel lack of motivation to immerse, I would use the same type of approach that I recommend one use with the SRS. The reality is, on a lot of those unmotivated days, you probably want to do zero immersion. So doing anything more than zero is going to be considered a huge win. It's another great opportunity to train your discipline. And even if, say, on 3 unmotivated days in a row, you only manage to do 10% of your immersion. Maybe on the 4th day, if you're still unmotivated, you can try to override the desire to stop at around 10% and try to do 15%. This is the way that one builds up discipline over time. It is through the very act of overriding the desire to not do something. And in fact, as you improve your discipline, your ape will slowly begin to understand that your computer will simply not allow it to just do nothing. And you will find that when the ape comes to understand that there is no escape, even it will begin to try to find ways to enjoy the activity more. Now, I must say that if you find that you're having to use discipline every single day just to get any immersion done, then that might be a warning sign that your goals might not be appropriately aligned with your desires. I feel that if immersion learning is something you really want to do, then on at least about half of the days, you should feel a pretty strong desire to go after your goals. Now in the next video, I'm going to talk about individual circumstances that can actually affect one's motivation to immerse or motivation to go after their immersion learning goals, even if their desire is actually pretty high. This, for example, can often happen if you're simply overworked and too tired, which greatly can affect one's motivation to immerse, even though if they weren't so tired, they happily would do so. So it truly is a multifaceted problem, and I really believe that a learner can benefit a lot from starting to think about it in that way. Another thing you can do is go ahead and swap some listening time for some reading time, or vice versa, depending on your preferences. And if you're a complete beginner, something you can do is just go ahead and watch target language content with native language subtitles. This is a much better alternative than completely foregoing interacting with your target language at all. It at least keeps your connection to that target language alive. Another strategy could be even to time box some time with native language subtitles and then some time without subtitles or with target language subtitles, for example. The key is just to find anything you can do to engage with your target language on those days where you feel demotivated. If you want to know more about how to engage with target language content in a more relaxed way at a lower level of attention, I recommend you watch my previous How to Immerse in a Foreign Language listening video, where I go more in depth about this topic. Ideally, I would say that if you have confidence that you'll more likely than not be able to get back on track very quickly, then reducing your immersion or SRS reviews for a period of time is probably the best route of action you can take. Just be wary if you find this becoming a habit though. In that case, it's probably much better to use a vacation add-on and just commit to doing immersion learning on less days to begin with. It's much better to just commit to doing something on less days in a sustainable manner than to have a goal of doing something 6 or 7 days a week that you never meet and serves as constant demotivation. Now, besides reducing your workload and taking a breather for a day, which I personally always find rejuvenating, it can also be useful to look over what you've already learned or rewatch a show that you watched a while ago and see your improvement. But as I will talk about in a moment, you should actually be very wary about checking for progress too often, as that can be highly discouraging. A final note that I would just say about motivation is that your reptile brain, or if you prefer, your ape, doesn't really like the idea of scheduled activities. It feels trapped knowing that it must do something at a particular time for a particular amount of time. I remember using this expression before, that setting daily goals is kind of like setting up a prison for your ape to sit in for a given part of the day. It definitely takes a certain amount of mental fortitude, which one can build over time, to happily walk into that situation day after day. In some of my future videos about productivity, I plan to talk to you about some of the tricks you can play on your ape to have it more readily walk into those situations without protest. The feeling of lack of progress is one that a lot of people seem to have. Honestly, my first recommendation is to stop being so involved in observing your level of improvement. It's okay to do, but only periodically. If you are strategic and ensure you put enough time in between each time you analyze if you're better than you used to be, then that analysis can serve as a great motivator. However, if you're constantly trying to measure minimal improvement and are failing to do so, it will only be discouraging. For example, when filling a large pool with a garden hose, you wouldn't need to check the water's level very much when first starting to fill it. As you would know, it's going to take a decent amount of time to fill. So instead, you would check at a certain reasonable interval to see how far along the filling process was. Language learning is much the same. As you approach your goal in a language, then it might be time to a bit more regularly check your level and make sure that you're meeting your goals, just as you would check the pool more often as it gets closer to your desired water level. It's important to have a theory about how your actual actions in the real world are going to affect your mood and motivation, and to purposefully and somewhat systematically do more of those actions that you've seen are likely to boost your motivation, while doing your best to avoid actions that are only likely to dampen it. If someone consistently acts in accordance with this principle and pays attention to when something they did made them feel positively or negatively towards their language learning, then in time it will become second nature, and you will gain an intuitive understanding of how certain activities can have a profound effect towards your mood and attitude towards your language learning goals. The key is to behave in a consistent way that can manage your mood towards your goals and towards your progress towards those goals. If you really need to measure your progress more often, then I recommend to use an objective measure to do so, such as the known word count in the Immerse with Migaku browser extension, or perhaps even just by your number of cards in your SRS. It's much better to use an objective measure that, as long as you're consistent, will only be increasing and therefore has a very low probability of being discouraging. Whereas if you were regularly trying to watch a particular show to check for improvements and then didn't notice any, you might only get discouraged. As long as you follow the principles of continuing to immerse through reading and listening and study new content in your SRS, you will continue to improve. Just make sure you give yourself enough time for those improvements to become visible before you go judging yourself too critically. Well guys, that's it for today's video. I hope you tune in to the next video where we continue to talk about these topics and talk about more strategies that can help us to consistently continue to make progress towards our language learning goals. If you're interested in helping us decide the direction of Migaku, joining our official Migaku Discord server, and gaining access to early releases of Migaku software, including the Immerse with Migaku browser extension and other bonus content, then please consider supporting Migaku on Patreon. As always, thank you so much for all my patrons. I literally couldn't do it without you. And of course, a special shout out to the $1 Leech tier. I consider myself blessed to have their support each and every day. If you need support with an issue you're having or would like to join the official Immerse with Migaku community on Reddit, you can find those links in the description below. If you would like a chance to win free VIP access to the official Migaku Discord server and Migaku software projects, then please subscribe to this channel and leave a like and comment on this video. At the end of every month, I choose 10 people to get a free behind the scenes look at the community we're building, and that number will be increasing as new Patreon milestones are reached. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found some value in today's video. See ya!